Girlcott, Chapter 2. I walked up the cemented pathway and around to the back garden of the huge white house with its bright orange push-out shutters. The latch on the orange wooden gate clicked as I lifted it, and instantly Mrs. Wallace appeared at the back door, a wide smile on her broad, round face. "You're right on time," she said, walking over to take my hand and leading me into the small breakfast room off the kitchen. "And you're all dressed up and pretty." When her dark blue eyes checked me over, a frown swept across her face and disappeared so quickly I thought I had imagined it. Her flowered blue blouse, worn outside her tight white pedal pushers, made her look like she was wearing a maternity outfit. Fiona was born on April 10th, 1955. I can still remember the exact date because it was Easter Sunday, and Dr. Crown, one of Papa's regular customers, at the garage, gave Papa the joke that the Wallaces were looking for a heavenly babysitter, and I was the only angel he thought would qualify. That was if I wanted to earn a few pennies after school. 4 years had passed, but Mrs. Wallace still looked pregnant. The smell of baked bread and a lemony scent wafted from the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, nodding in the direction of the table at the center of the room. Then she disappeared through the archway that led to the kitchen. This was always my favorite room. Under the large picture window was a soft padded seat, and beside it a small shelf filled with picture books, a few I had given to Fiona. We often sat reading and playing games here. Before tucking her into bed, I would fix her favorite peanut butter and jam sandwich and read several of the stories she demanded. I glided over to the window overlooking the back garden with its rainbow blooms. Blue African violets, pink periwinkles, pink and white frangipani, yellow nasturtiums, and a cluster of white narcissus. Fiona could name them because I taught her to recognize each one. My gaze traveled beyond the garden, and for the first time I noticed that I could see the Island Theater, the place where I was to take my class on Saturday. I gaped, for the theater was about 39 feet from the bottom of the road, about 13 yards from the Wallaces. No wonder she was so nervous about a boycott that nobody I knew was giving a second thought. Angry voices coming from the kitchen made me swing round. Mrs. Wallace's voice was shrill and scratchy, but the loud voice, an octave higher, was coming from Elmira, who was home for the summer holidays. Although I couldn't understand the argument, I did hear Mrs. Wallace tell her daughter to keep her voice down. Elmira responded by calling her mother an old-fashioned cow. Mrs. Wallace shuffled into the breakfast room, balancing a tray with 4 large submarine sandwiches and 2 tall glasses of lemonade. The ice clashed against the glasses as she strutted over to the table. A smile turned up one corner of her lips, making her mouth look lopsided. I glanced away so that she wouldn't notice the amused expression on my face. "I tried to get Elmira to join us," she said, placing the food on the table that was set for 2. "She's supposed to be going to the beach with a boyfriend." The word boyfriend dropped from her mouth like a bitter berry. "Come sit down," she patted a chair, still wearing her distorted smile. "Janet baked these submarine rolls yesterday." She wiggled in a chair opposite me and placed the huge bun on her plate. "They're packed with goodies: chicken, roast beef, corned beef, onions." She peeled open the top layer, her sniff sounding like a snort. "Oh, some celery, lettuce, and red tomatoes." I was handed a plate. My nostrils flickered from the crusty smell of delicious bread. If the taste was as good as the smell, I would have no trouble eating 2 or more large submarine sandwiches. I was about to take a bite when Elmira appeared and stood in the archway, a bright green beach towel around her shoulders. She leaned against the wall, her hands on her hips, posing in green rock and roll slacks with the zippers at the bottom. Her pants were so tight she seemed to be stitched into them. When I looked at her feet, I noticed she was wearing platform heel sandals that showed off bright red toenails. I tucked my brown and white saddle shoes farther under the table. "Come join us, Mira." Mrs. Wallace rested the lemonade on my placemat without looking up at her daughter. "It's no trouble making another sandwich. Janet left everything there just perfectly and ready to devour." "Mother, I'm going to Pink Beach with Nigel." She giggled, looking her mother up and down. "Be careful, Janet's submarines will swell those hips." Mrs. Wallace's face matched the red tomatoes. Still giggling, Elmira unglued herself from the wall and swung back into the kitchen. My breath puffed out with relief when the door slammed behind her. "I don't know what I would do without Janet," Mrs. Wallace said, her face still tomato-colored. "Janet makes everything from scratch. Janet even spiked the lemonade with ginger beer." She paused and bit off a big chunk of submarine, her mouth rotating in cud fashion. Then she sipped the lemonade, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. Janet is such a beautiful person, she went on, not taking a breath. I don't mean in looks, mind you. I mean in disposition. She goes out of her way to do anything I ask. Her laugh was stifled as she bit off another chunk of submarine sandwich. Dabbing her mouth delicately with the linen napkin, she continued to raise Janet to sainthood. I looked down at my plate so that she wouldn't notice my boredom, for I knew the song of praise would ring out for some time. I turned down the volume. Janet Giblin was not one of my favorite people. Once a member of the same church we attend, the St. Matthew AME Church, she left last year to join the Holy Way Assembly, an interdenominational group that was new on the island. Mrs. Giblin said she was attracted to their way of worship, particularly since more white people attended the Holy Way Assembly than our church. I still remember when Janet Giblin told Mrs. Matters, the minister's wife, not to give me the summer job keeping the books for the young people's accounts, because I was already too swell-headed and high-minded. Her son, Albert, got the job, but he didn't last long because the books never balanced. Then she accused everyone of being unfair to him, and she left the church soon after. She must have bowed down to the Holy Way congregation because in no time, Albert went to a boarding school in Canada on a missionary scholarship. When he was expelled, Mr. Wallace took pity on Mrs. Giblin, and Albert was sent to a military academy somewhere in the United States. That really made her the Wallace's slave, and everything since had been Janet, Janet, Janet. My dear Desma, you're such a slow eater. Hearing Mrs. Wallace say my name turned up my volume, and I noticed that she had helped herself to the second submarine while I still hadn't worked my way through the first. Here, spread some mayonnaise on it. I prefer ketchup myself, but Janet tells me you colored Bermudians like your mayonnaise and pickle on sandwiches. I watched as she dipped the dish into the dish of ketchup and spread it, like congealed blood, on her sandwich. I shuddered at the look of it, and then I spread a small drop of mayonnaise on mine and took a bite. To my surprise, it was delicious. Does something to your taste buds, doesn't it? Mrs. Wallace was watching me and smiling between her vigorous chews. She patted the side of her mouth with her napkin and then shook her head. No wonder Janet and I have a weight problem and you don't. When you first came to work, you were no fatter than a piece of fennel. Now you are a piece of fennel with a very promising figure. I envy you. Even Almira wishes she had your shape. She took another sip of the lemonade, still watching me, still half smiling. Then, not waiting for my comment, added, Almira is tough about looks. She's angry with the world because she doesn't look like a movie star. Her present idol is Natalie somebody. Would, I started to say, but changed my mind because I was beginning to get uneasy about this bite to eat. Her endless prattle made me realize she had something on her mind, but was finding it difficult to bring it out into the open. Where's Fiona, Mrs. Wallace? I asked, noticing that the house was unusually quiet. I knew she was never put down for a nap so late in the afternoon for fear she would stay awake half the night. There was a short silence, disturbed by the faint clinking of ice floating in Mrs. Wallace's almost empty glass. Slowly, the glass was given a resting place near the scrap of an unfinished submarine. She looked at me, her head at an acute angle. Actually, she's in Somerset with some friends of ours. Her father felt it was safer there because we live so close to the theaters, and we don't know what's going to happen with the boycott. You know about that boycott, don't you? Before I could answer, she went on, frankly, I don't see you colored Bermudians behind that clandestine progressive group. They must be a bunch of foreign rabble-rousers, or worse still, communists. She picked up her glass, shook it again, but there was no clink, for the ice had disappeared. She stared at the liquid as if expecting a genie to appear. When she spoke again, her voice was high and shrill. You colored people are too well-fed and polite to bite the hand that feeds you. No telling what the progressive group will stir up with a boycott. That's why we wanted Almira to go with Fiona, but a door slammed as if on cue. Almira burst into the breakfast room. Did the phone ring for me? She yelled at her mother. Nigel called, didn't he? No, he didn't, dear, said Mrs. Wallace, picking up an unfinished sandwich from her plate and sniffing it. Were you expecting him to call? Mother, you know I was expecting him to call. You know Nigel was taking me to the movies after I came from the beach with Claudia. You just don't like Nigel because you think his parents aren't good enough. Almira's voice went higher and higher after each sentence, and when it squeaked, she burst into tears. Finally, she stamped out of the room, and I heard several doors slam like a drumbeat. Mrs. Wallace folded her napkin into small squares and then unfolded it. I thought at first she was going to Elmira, but she remained in the chair, her head down. I lost my appetite and wished for the 100th time I had stayed home for Mama's big helping of tuna casserole. All our nerves are on edge right now. Mrs. Wallace threw her napkin on the table, staggering to her feet, and collected the plates of submarine remains. If you turn on the radio for some music, all you hear is that a boycott's going to start soon. If you pick up the newspaper, again, all you read is that a boycott is going to start soon. I tried to tell Elmira to go to Somerset until the whole thing blows over, but she wouldn't listen. Then looking at my half-eaten sandwich, she added, "You're even upset. Oh dear, I didn't invite you here to upset you with talk of that boycott." I said nothing. My parents made it a rule never to have a disagreeable conversation at the table. A silence swept into the room, clearing away the excitement I had felt about the visit. What did coming here have to do with the boycott? I should have stayed home and waited for Eileen's call. I would have accomplished more than wondering what was on in Mrs. Wallace's mind. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly. I jumped from the unexpectedness of the question. "Almost 16, I said. My birthday is next week." "And when do you finish school?" "First week of July." The twisted smile reappeared, but this time both corners of her lips turned down. 16 seems so young to be finishing high school, she said, putting the plate down and speaking slowly. "Elmira doesn't finish until she's 18. Collegiate Institute goes by the British system," I explained, picking my words carefully. "We have to wait until the 5th form to take the Oxbridge exams from England. If we pass the subjects, we graduate from high school." "I know about that antiquated system," Mrs. Wallace interrupted. "I also know you can be a brilliant student for all of your 5 years, take that exam and fail. Then you fail your 5 years of school because you have no certificate to show for it." Mrs. Wallace was right. I thought of Charity Lamb, who had taken the exam last year and had failed. She repeated it and barely passed her subjects. If she had been successful last year, she would not be with my class. Although I would invite Charity Lamb to the movies, she would not attend because her father was so strict. He believed that movies and parties were sinful. At least she wouldn't be disappointed if the boycott spoiled our fun. Mrs. Wallace's voice rose, and I was forced to pay attention to what she was saying. "I really don't see the point of having foreign examiners mark such an important exam. They're all the way in England, for heaven's sake. That's one of the reasons we took Elmira out of this British system. I keep telling her she's lucky to be in such an expensive all-girls boarding school, meeting so many important people. That should have more merit than your Oxbridge exam. But she'd rather be here in your shoes." I thought of the wedge heels and couldn't help smiling. "Janet tells me you've got a good head on your shoulders." I noticed that she was avoiding looking at me directly. Janet was not one to compliment me, so I was surprised at the remark. "Speaking of Janet," she went on, still avoiding eye contact, "she made some delicious loquat joke for dessert last night, and even I couldn't eat it all. There's some left over for our dessert today." I had never heard of loquat joke. Loquat chutney and loquat jam, which Mrs. Charter, our next-door neighbor, makes when the fruit is in season, but never loquat joke. I wondered if this was a joke on me. Now looking directly at me, Mrs. Wallace giggled. I'd never had the dessert until Janet came to work for us. When I first tasted it, I was reminded of an apricot dish I enjoyed as a child. Janet said her family was so poor that dessert was a luxury, but they did have lots of loquat trees growing wild everywhere. She rubbed her lips together and continued. One day, her grandmother came up with the idea of making a dessert from the loquats. She mixed condensed milk with Jell-O and anything else that was sweet around the house. Guessing what was going into the dessert became a family joke, and the name stuck, loquat joke. When loquats are in season, Janet preserves several bottles. As if tasting her words, she wiped the tip of her tongue slowly over her lips, made a smacking sound, and said through more giggles, "Why am I talking when we could be tasting?" But she continued talking as she hurried into the kitchen, armed with a tray of submarine scraps. "I couldn't exist without Janet. She's such a gem." Her muttering seeped back into the breakfast room. I was about to get up and look out of the window again when Elmira floated into the room. She had exchanged her original outfit for an eyelet blouse similar to mine, except that it was off her shoulders. Her ponytail was tied high in her head with a green chiffon scarf, and I noticed that white bobby socks were encased in her brown and white saddle shoes. "Mother, bring me some of that loquat joke," she yelled, her eyes fixed on my face. She flopped down into the chair next to me, leaned over, and whispered, "Janet eats in the kitchen." Fresh air seemed to seep from the room. I looked past her bare shoulders to the Pride of India tree outside the window. If only I'd gotten up before she came into the room. Mother goes out of her way for you. She leaned closer to my face and continued with a sneer. Everything's Desmond's this, Desmond that. Mother even took away my chance to babysit Fiona so that you could make money because she said you needed it more than me. And you know what else? She and Daddy think I'm too serious about Nigel, so they sent me off to that stupid place they call a ladies' finishing school. It finishes you all right. I've had enough. I began to feel sorry for her, but not for long. Wait till you find out why she's sweetening you up like white company. Just then, Mrs. Wallace returned carrying a tray. The 3 dishes were like snow-capped mountains topped with almond flakes. I turned away from Almira and gaped at the size of the dishes. There was no way I was going to get through eating my loquat joke. I wouldn't be able to eat anyway. My appetite had disappeared in the face of Almira's smirk as she sat with her elbows propped on the table, her eyes saying she knew something I didn't. Mrs. Wallace placed the first dish in front of Almira. She then put the next one on her placemat and finally the last dish in front of me. Almira grinned, pointed to her dish and then to mine. White company, she mouthed. I ignored her and dipped my spoon into the soft, creamy top. It melted on my tongue. This was no joke. This was so scrumptious. It's delicious, Mrs. Wallace. She smiled between her own mouthfuls, and I watched Almira make scalped patterns around the edge of the dish with her spoon. Don't waste it, dear. If you don't want it, I'll eat it. Almira took a large mouthful and licked the back of the spoon with a slurping noise. I'm only eating it because I don't want you to get big and fat like Janet. Don't be rude, Almira. Don't be rude. Her mother's voice crackled like dry leaves. If you're not going to eat it, why don't you leave the 2 of us alone? Almira tilted her head at a right angle and gave her mother a sly grin. I'm not leaving you 2 alone, Mother. I'm staying right here to give you moral support when you pop the question. She then went back to making loud slurps with her spoon. I want you to leave this minute. The words blasted from Mrs. Wallace's mouth. My hands flew up from my lap. Almira jumped out of her seat and grabbed the dish of loquat joke. I'm off, I'm off, I'm off. With the last off, she was behind the archway, laughing until she hiccuped. Mrs. Wallace waited for a few minutes, rubbed her mouth with the napkin, then folded into squares before placing it beside the empty dish. When she spoke, she pronounced each word slowly, sounding like someone who was learning the English language. Desma, it's time I got to the point. I'd like to have you come work for me looking after Fiona. Of course, it would mean sleeping in, but you would be paid well. The words rolled together in one breath. I did manage to hear it would mean sleeping in. Well, Desma, Mrs. Wallace said when I didn't respond. I looked up, my eyes avoiding her face. I don't understand, Mrs. Wallace. I'm offering you a job to looking after Fiona, Desma, a chance to make good money now that you'll be leaving high school. My first reaction was to say right out no, but I could tell by the way she folded her arms across her hefty bosom that she was ready to argue her point, whatever it was. I already have plans after I leave Collegiate Institute, I said politely. You have a job already? Let me know what they're paying you and I'll pay you more. It's not about a job. I'm going to be tutored for some exams I intend to take. They're hard exams and studying for them will take up a lot of my time. I was getting all tongue-tied and not making any sense. I don't understand. Why are you doing more studying if you finished high school? I want to go to college. I want to take up actuarial science and become an actuary. My voice dropped lower and lower until I was barely whispering. Words seemed to be sticking to my throat, making me suffocate. I coughed nervously. Mrs. Wallace leaned so far back in her chair, and I thought for a fearful moment that she was going to topple over, but she caught her balance and wobbled to her feet. Her voice rose. Are you telling me, Desma, that you're turning down my offer for some career? An actuary? What in the world is that? It's actuary, Mrs. Wallace. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I was sure she could hear the racket it was making. I was about to say that an actuary has to be good in maths, but that would have sounded like bragging. So instead I said, an actuary helps insurance companies and businesses take risks to become successful. I could tell by the way her eyes popped wide that I didn't make any sense. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her tone was sharp enough to cut the words into small pieces. I can bet you any money it's closed to coloreds. Ignoring her remark, I said quickly, I plan to study hard for the exams, and I believe if I pass them, I can be an actuary. I'm not sure if it was my tone of voice or my insistence that made Mrs. Wallace's eyes change from wide to narrow. I looked away when I noticed that Almira had returned and was leaning against the archway, her arms folded and her face split in a wide grin. Mrs. Wallace continued as if we were the only two in the room. I think you need to give my offer more thought, Desma. You'll have your own room. I even plan to let you have Almira's old television. I'm getting a bigger one, Almira interrupted. When we go to Virginia, to our summer home, you'll go with us. Have you ever been to America? Without looking up, I told her I hadn't, and I tried not to let the indifference creep into my voice. Turning her down her offer was like poking a stick at a saucy dog. Well, think of the opportunity. How many colored girls your age have been to America? I told you mother she wouldn't take the job. Almira entered the room and leaned on the table. Didn't I tell you she acts like she's not colored? Didn't I? Even Janet told you that. Let me handle this. Mrs. Wallace was almost nose to nose with her daughter. This is none of your business. But Almira flopped down in a chair near to me. And you know something else? Her mother backed away. I'm glad. Why should she be enjoying this house while I have to be at that miserable old school? She's colored, but you treat her better than me. Almira, Mrs. Wallace shouted. Before I could bat my eyelashes, she pranced in front of Almira and yanked her to her feet. But her daughter wiggled from her grasp and rushed to stand a safe distance away in the archway. Let's face it, Mother, she's made a loquat joke out of you. You went to all this trouble to wait on her like she's white company, and she's turned you down flat. Reaching under the table, I picked up my purse. Thanks for everything, Mrs. Wallace, I said, trying to be polite as I rose, my body trembling. Don't you dare walk out of this room. With the agility of a clumsy elephant, Mrs. Wallace stamped in front of me and held up a plump hand. Who do you think you are walking out of my house like a grand dame? As an actuary, ma'am. Almira almost split in half as she doubled over with laughter. What's going on here? All three of us froze in position. Mr. Wallace stood in the archway behind Almira. Oh, darling, I'm so glad you're here. His wife's face seemed to crumble as she sat down heavily on a chair. Her husband, dressed in a navy blue Bermuda shorts with long matching socks, and his blazer thrown over his arm, blocked out the opening to the archway. Almira quickly unfroze, looked over at her father, squeezed past him, and vanished. He looked at me and then his wife and then back at me. Although he was frowning, he did not seem angry. Bridget, what is this all about? John, you wouldn't believe Desma has refused the offer to look after Fiona. She must have a reason, he smiled at me. I've always liked Mr. Wallace, and I looked at him now, happy that there was no anger in his voice. Her reason is that she wants to take some exams. She claims she's going to be an actuary or something like that. Even telling me what it's about doesn't make sense. I knew if I corrected Mrs. Wallace, I would appear rude, so I said nothing. It can't be actuary, he turned to me. Is that what my wife is trying to say? Yes, Mr. Wallace, I'll be busy studying for the exams, so I can't. You'll never be an actuary, Desma. His calm voice had hardened. My wife is right about that. You're colored and you're a girl. I don't know of any colored men in that field, let alone colored women. I didn't tell him about Mr. Myers, the colored actuary my math teacher, Mrs. Burrows, had contacted to coach me in the exams. Didn't I tell you, John? Mrs. Wallace had exchanged her stricken look for a triumphant one. Speak to her about her arrogance. Bridget, I've had a hard day. Everybody seems to be on edge. He looked tired when he turned back to me. Desma, why don't you think it over? You're good with Fiona, and we think the world of you. The pay's more than you'll get anywhere else, too. Mr. Wallace arranged his jacket on the back of his chair as he stood next to me, and I could smell the cedar scent of his cologne. He reached over, patted my hand, and smiled. I smiled, feeling like he would understand, even though he'd made the remarks about me being colored and a girl. Mr. Wallace made his money selling real estate. Janet had bragged at church meetings that he started his business from scratch and was now very successful. I felt proud that my papa also started his garage from scratch and was successful. While he wasn't rich like Mr. Wallace, we were what people called comfortable. Most important, Papa was always praised for the quality of his work. I felt more proud of my papa. He had so many customers that many times Mama would go to the garage to keep him company because she said Papa's head loved his chest if he got tired. I always marveled at how he made broken down cars and bicycles look like new after he waved his magic wand over them. Mr. Wallace would understand. My father had to work hard like you to start his business, I said, beaming from one Wallace to the next. When I think he had to leave school at 13 and where he is now, nobody thought that he would ever make it. He tells me all the time I can be anything I want to be. After the words tumbled out, I realized I had made a mistake. Both Wallaces were staring at me, their mouths and eyes as wide as bicycle wheels. Are you comparing your father to me? Mr. Wallace was the first to speak, his voice still calm, but his usual smile replaced by a snarl. Now you see what I mean, John, added Mrs. Wallace, looking pleased. I'm not comparing. I don't want you to think I'm turning down the job because I feel stuck up. I want to be an actuary more than anything in the world. I stopped, for the words were gushing out like a stream. Quickly changing to my normal voice, I said with more confidence, you understand why I can't take the job. But they didn't. They were still staring at me, their eyes now as expressionless as statues in a wax museum. Cold and unblinking, I wanted to flee from the room, but my feet wouldn't move. This is not a good time to be defiant, Desma, Mr. Wallace said. I can tell you now that you stand as much chance of being an actuary as an ice cube has in hell. What's more, you have an attitude that could get you into serious trouble. Think about it. You have a way of talking back. That's considered insolent, but we won't hold that against you. The offer still stands. We would like for you to work here and look after Fiona, so think it over. I felt as if I had been dropped into a cement mixer, and it was whirling round and round. How I managed to answer without bursting into tears was a miracle. I don't have to think it over. I want to be an actuary. I like babysitting Fiona, but I'm just not cut out to be a servant. This came from Mrs. Wallace. She now sounded like Almira. That's not what I said. What I mean is, that's enough, Desma. I could tell Mr. Wallace was dismissing me. An actuary. Who in the world put such an idea in your head? Do you realize that colored people in Bermuda are better off than colored people anywhere else in the world? You people have your own homes. Most of you, you own cars. You eat plenty. The lists of your good fortune, thanks to people like me, are endless. Yet you prefer to pay attention to foreign rabble-rousers and throw away everything with a boycott, a riot, or whatever else you think would work. It won't. Let me tell you, the lot of you won't ever intimidate us. The anger that I had tried so hard to control burst out. My father works hard for everything he has, and a lot of colored people like him work hard too. He started his garage from scratch, and look where he is today. And if he wants me to work, and he wants me to work hard at whatever I want to become. That's enough, Mr. Wallace said. I'm sorry you don't understand. That's enough. This time he yelled. I'm not here to argue with you about your folly in turning down a job you're capable of doing. I always thought you had better sense. I was wrong. Now you may leave. I walked past them and out of the house, feeling as though I had been kicked 100 times. An actuary. Imagine that. I heard Mr. Wallace say as I closed the back door behind me. But it was Mrs. Wallace's high-pitched laugh that made me angry. The sound seeped through the keyhole as I walked through the gate. When I passed the match-me-if-you-can hedge with none of its leaves matching, I could feel my head spinning with fury.